On February 12, 2022, John Young and Marvin Miller set out to explore a newly discovered cave in Texas, eager for adventure and the thrill of the unknown. The cave had just been uncovered, with its narrow passages and deep pits presenting a real challenge for the duo. As they descended into the dark, cool cave, the excitement of the unknown spurred them forward. After a 10-foot down climb, they reached a belly crawl, squeezing through several tight fissures that eventually opened into a larger room. Young, always up for a challenge, took on the most difficult part, a 4-foot deep fissure leading to a small room at the edge of a larger pit. He navigated the tight slot, feeling the thrill of discovery as he reached the other side. But the excitement soon turned to frustration. When it was time to return, Young realized he couldn't climb back up through the narrow fissure. The constriction was too tight, and no matter how hard he pushed, he couldn't find the leverage to pull himself through. Trapped with no way to move, panic began to creep in. John Young was trapped from below, his gut, groin, and waist caught in the unforgiving grip of the narrow fissure. The rock squeezed his lower body like a vice, pressing into his abdomen with brutal force. He could feel the weight of the cave crushing him from the bottom, making it impossible to move his legs. The pressure around his groin was unbearable, sending sharp waves of pain shooting up through his body every time he tried to shift. His waist was wedged so tightly that every breath felt like a battle. His stomach compressed against the hard stone. The pain radiated through his core, and with each failed attempt to push himself free, the rocks seemed to close in tighter. It was as if the cave was swallowing him whole, slowly squeezing the life out of him from the waist down. Miller, sensing the urgency, quickly left the cave to retrieve tools, a hammer, chisel, rope, and other gear. He returned and tried to widen the tight shaft himself, chiseling at the rock in an attempt to free his friend. But despite his best efforts, it wasn't enough. The passage was too narrow, and the clock was ticking. Realizing they needed more help, Miller made the tough decision to leave the cave once more, this time to call for professional assistance. Soon, a rescue crew arrived, including Kurt Menking, Bennett Lee, Greg Mosier, Joe Ranzow, Angela Young, Lisa Miller, Matt Saltz, and the local EMS fire and rescue teams. Together, they devised a plan to free Young from his rocky prison. They began by carefully chiseling away at the rock around John's waist and hips, widening the fissure inch by inch. The tension in the air was thick, as each hammer strike had to be precise. One wrong move could cause the rocks to shift unpredictably. The team set up a pulley system to help lift him out once the space was wide enough. They also brought in a pile of rocks, which they placed beneath John's feet to give him some much-needed leverage. As they worked, John remained calm, though the pressure on his lower body was immense. His muscles ached, and the constant squeezing of his waist and gut was agonizing. Every time he tried to push himself upward, the rock seemed to fight back, holding him down. But with the extra support of the rocks beneath his feet, he finally had a foothold. Slowly, with the rescuers pulling from above, and John pushing with every ounce of strength he had left, he managed to rise up. After hours of effort, John was finally able to wriggle free from the grip of the cave. This close call was a reminder of how unpredictable cave exploration can be, and how even the most seasoned adventurers must stay prepared. For Young and Miller, their day of exploration had turned into a test of endurance and teamwork, and they emerged with a story of resilience and survival. However, in the next story, the spelunkers weren't that lucky. They were warned by many, but they still went on to play with their lives. On Saturday, February 22, 1975, a tragic event unfolded in the depths of Salamander Cave, located near Bloomington, Indiana. Heavy rains and rising waters turned what was supposed to be an afternoon of exploration into a nightmare for 3 university freshmen, Alan Aldrich, Marcia Ann Bott, and Terry Lee Yokem, none of whom could have imagined the life-threatening danger they were walking into. It had been raining for days, saturating the ground in the region. Salamander Cave, a popular spot for beginner cavers, became treacherous as the rainwater began flooding the passages inside. A stream that usually flowed gently through the cave was now surging rapidly, threatening to fill the cave with water. Despite warnings from more experienced cavers, the 3 freshmen, led by Aldrich, ventured into the cave just after 1 p.m. Aldrich had some previous caving experience, but neither Bott nor Yokem had any, and none were members of any organized caving group. Aldrich and Yokem had hard hats and carbide lamps, while Bott carried only a large flashlight. Unfortunately, none of them were prepared for the deadly combination of rising water and narrow, dark tunnels. At the entrance, they were met by a group led by John Abney, who was leaving the cave due to the rising water. He warned them of the danger, urging them to turn back, but the 3 freshmen ignored the warning and pressed on. A second warning came from Kathy Hoey, a graduate student studying aquatic life in the cave. She had entered earlier that morning but decided to leave when the water began to rise to boot-top level. Hoey later warned another group, who wisely exited the cave shortly after seeing the situation for themselves. Despite the warnings, Aldrich, Bott, and Yokem continued deeper into Salamander Cave, unaware of the disaster that was about to strike. Despite their efforts, it became clear that the floodwaters were coming in too fast. The cave, which had once seemed like an adventure, had turned into a death trap. By the time they realized the severity of their situation, it was likely too late, since the storm outside intensified. Heavy downpours hit the area, causing the water in the cave to rise more rapidly. By 8:15 p.m., Michael Moore and Jim Keith, called by the Indiana State Police, arrived at the cave to check on the situation. They found only 18 inches of airspace left at the entrance passage. The cave was rapidly filling with water, leaving very little room for anyone to escape. By 10:10 p.m., Moore, Keith, and another caver, Don Paquette, returned to Salamander Cave to search for the missing students. Muddy footprints marked the cave floor, showing where they had tried to navigate the rising waters. Scratches on rocks near the entrance suggested they had clung to the slippery cave walls, fighting against the surging water. One of their carbide lamps had been dropped, barely flickering, signaling the panic that had begun to take hold. Even a half-eaten snack was found on a ledge, perhaps from a brief moment when they had stopped, trying to regroup or figure out how to escape. If the trio waited in the large passages of Breakdown Mountain, they might have survived the flood. But the group perhaps decided to press on. In fact, the water rose so high that there was only about an inch of airspace remaining near the ceiling of an 8-foot-high section of the cave, but this would not have been enough for a human to survive. The narrow passage that once seemed navigable had transformed into a death trap. Traces indicated Aldrich, Bott, and Yokem likely struggled desperately to stay above the water, pressing against the ceiling, fighting for every breath. But as the airspace diminished, their chances of survival vanished. Trapped with no way out, the rising flood overwhelmed them and they were found drowned. Just a short distance from the cave's entrance, their struggle lost to the relentless floodwaters. Less than 100 feet into the entrance passage, they made a grim discovery. Kim Aldrich and Marcia Bott had drowned. Their bodies were found lying in the water, trapped by the rising floodwaters. Despite the devastation, Terry Yokem was still missing, and the rescuers hoped he had managed to escape to a higher spot deeper in the cave, possibly at Breakdown Mountain. The cave's layout added to the peril. About 500 feet from the entrance was Breakdown Mountain, a massive 30-foot-high passage known as a potential refuge during floods. Beyond it, the stream passage rose, but the floodwaters that day were relentless. The rescuers believed that if Yokem had made it past the final turn in the entrance passage, he might have survived by taking shelter in one of the higher spots upstream. However, with the rain still pouring and the water continuing to rise, the rescuers were forced to leave the cave without recovering the bodies. They notified authorities, but the ongoing flooding made any further search attempts impossible until the next morning. By the time rescuers re-entered the cave after 8 a.m. the following day, it was too late. Terry Yokem's body was found a short distance from his companions. The tragedy could be traced back to several factors: lack of preparation, poor judgment, and ultimately panic. The freshmen had entered the cave without proper gear or knowledge of caving in flood-prone environments. They had ignored multiple warnings and, as the water levels rose, likely became frightened and attempted to flee. But it was too late. The caving community was left shaken by the loss. In their post-mortem analysis, they stressed the importance of proper preparation, knowledge, and caution when exploring caves, especially during periods of heavy rainfall. It was a bitter winter morning on February 27, 2004, as the frost clung stubbornly to the Kentucky hills. A group of eager Boy Scouts gathered at the mouth of Sweet Potato Cave, their breaths visible in the cold air. Among the scouts was Jesse Gott, a 14-year-old who was no stranger to adventure. The excitement of the day was palpable as they prepared for the caving expedition, the thrill of exploration burning through the icy chill. Sweet Potato Cave, tucked away in the rural landscape of Kentucky, was both a wonder and a challenge. Surrounded by rolling hills and dense woodlands, the cave was part of an intricate network of limestone formations, carved over thousands of years by underground streams. Its entrance, small and unassuming, lay hidden among the trees, as if guarding the secrets within. The narrow passageways twisted and turned, leading deep into the earth, with crevices so tight that even the most experienced divers had to tread cautiously. But for this group of scouts, the cave was familiar territory. They had visited before and knew its winding paths well enough to feel confident. With helmets and headlamps securely fastened, they plunged into the darkness, their laughter echoing off the cool, damp walls as they navigated through the initial passages. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until they stumbled upon a narrow crevice deeper inside the cave. It was a tight squeeze, far narrower than any passage they had encountered that day, but Jesse's curiosity got the better of him. The scouts' leaders, including Andrew Duncan, cautioned him to stay back, warning him that it could be dangerous. But Jesse was determined to see what lay on the other side. He had always been the kind of boy who pushed limits, unwilling to settle for anything less than extraordinary. Ignoring the warnings, Jesse wedged himself into the crevice. At first, it was exhilarating. The thought of discovering something unseen by his friends made his heart race with excitement. But that excitement quickly turned to panic as the walls of the crevice closed in around him. He could no longer move forward or backward. His chest was tightly wedged between the rock walls, and no amount of effort could free him. The more he struggled, the more the cave seemed to tighten its grip on him. Panic rose within him as memories of other cavers getting stuck in similarly terrifying situations flooded his mind. He had heard those stories, but like many, he had never believed it could happen to him. Until now. Andrew Duncan, noticing Jesse's distress, rushed to his side. Andrew would later recount. Jesse's face was a mask of fear, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The excitement that had once filled the air was replaced by an eerie silence as the other scouts gathered around, unsure of what to do. Some of the younger scouts murmured words of encouragement, their voices trembling with worry. As the minutes passed, Jesse's panic deepened. His chest tightened, not just from the physical pressure of the cave walls, but from the overwhelming fear that he might not get out. He tried to calm himself, focusing on his breathing, but it was nearly impossible. The darkness of the cave, once a thrilling adventure, now seemed to press in on him from all sides. Andrew and a few other scouts stayed with Jesse, trying to reassure him while some of the others ran back toward the entrance to call for help. Jesse's mind raced as he tried to control the mounting fear. His hands were growing numb from the cold and his body was beginning to tremble. No one had noticed yet, but hypothermia was starting to set in. The biting cold of the cave, combined with the inability to move, was taking its toll on him. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours as Jesse remained wedged in the narrow crevice. Andrew and the other scouts did their best to comfort him, but there was little they could do. The helplessness of the situation weighed heavily on them all. Meanwhile, the call for help had reached the local firefighters and rescue squad. The urgency of the situation prompted a swift response, and within a short time, a rescue team was assembled and on its way to the cave. These were seasoned rescuers trained for such emergencies, but they knew that time was critical. Every minute Jesse spent trapped in the cold, narrow crevice increased the risk to his life. When the rescuers finally arrived, they quickly made their way into the cave, their hearts heavy with the weight of the task ahead. The sight of Jesse trapped in the darkness, his body wedged tightly between the unforgiving rock walls, tugged at their emotions. He needed medical attention immediately, not just for his injuries, but also to combat the hypothermia that was quickly setting in. They wasted no time wrapping Jesse in blankets and heating pads, trying to warm his body as they formulated a plan to free him. Using shovels and crowbars, they began to work on widening the narrow passage. The sound of metal scraping against stone filled the cave, each clink a reminder that the clock was ticking. Jesse tried to stay calm as the rescuers worked tirelessly. He could hear the muffled voices of his friends and the rescuers, but everything felt distant. His body was cold, his fingers numb, but he clung to the hope that soon he would be free. The hours stretched on, but finally, there was a breakthrough. The rescuers managed to widen the crevice enough to begin pulling Jesse free. With a collective effort, they carefully maneuvered him out of the crack. The moment Jesse was freed, a wave of relief washed over everyone. Cheers echoed through the cave, and the scouts, who had been holding their breath for hours, finally exhaled in unison. Jesse was immediately carried out of the cave and taken to a local hospital, where doctors were waiting to assess his condition. Though the ordeal had left him with mild hypothermia, the medical team worked quickly to warm him and monitor his recovery. Miraculously, despite the cold and the fear, Jesse had made it through the ordeal with only minor physical harm. As the sun began to set that evening, Jesse was discharged from the hospital. The events of the day had left a lasting impression on him and his fellow scouts. It was a day none of them would ever forget. A day of fear, courage, and ultimately, survival.